There is so much power. They have so much control over decisions. And these 9 justices, they can change an individual's life 100% with just a decision.
The Supreme Court has a very limited but very, very important role, which is to interpret those laws and apply those laws. And when they stray, they open themselves up to the charge of politicization.
The courts primarily look at an issue in terms of what the law does allow or does not allow. Now, does it have some political impact? I think that that probably is true. Does it have a political intent? I think that that is probably not true.
There's a crisis of confidence, and if the American people don't trust the judgment of their courts, that's a real problem for our democracy.
Congress has an obligation to take back power. There are so many cases that we think of that Congress could override that would overturn these decisions that, hurt the little guy, for example.
The Supreme Court is made up of human beings, and so whatever human beings do will be imperfect. They're shielded because we want them to be neutral. But if they're going to be neutral, then they have to act neutral. If they're going to be political, then they shouldn't be shielded.
I don't believe that the court is broken on some fundamental level. I think calls to fix the court tend to go along with the politics of the moment.
Good evening. In a landmark ruling, the Supreme Court today legalized abortions.
We are on the air because the United States Supreme Court has reached a decision in the case of Bush versus Gore.
The Supreme Court today struck down restrictions on political spending by corporations and unions.
Now to that historic Supreme Court decision legalizing same-sex marriage across the land, and it's profound.
My name is Lily Ledbetter, and I became well known across the country when I stood up for equal pay for equal work. I had a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court. Back when I went to work for Goodyear Tire and Rubber, they told me in personnel, you never discuss your pay while working here. If you do, you will not work here. You will not have a job. So no one ever discussed their pay. I learned by anonymous tipster that I was being paid 40% less than my male peers doing the exact same job, just a different shift. I was devastated. The first thing that I thought about was how much this had cost me and my family, how much we had done without when I had actually earned the money and should have been paid. I knew that I was entitled to equal pay for equal work under the law. It actually took 9 years from the time I filed that charge with the Equal Employment Commission until I got the final verdict from the Supreme Court in May of '07.
Our cases make it clear that an EEOC charge must be filed within 180 days of the unlawful employment decision itself, even if its effects are not felt until later.
I was sad that I did not know and was not in the court the day that the verdict came out, because Justice Ginsburg read that dissent. She cut to the bone with those 5 justices who ruled against my case.
In our view, the court does not comprehend or is indifferent to the insidious way in which women can be victims of pay discrimination.
It wasn't the money at that point, it was about what was right. And it should have been ruled in my favor, and it would have helped other people along the way. But that's what, in Washington, evidently they did not want to happen.
The U.S. Supreme Court is the court of last resort. It makes a decision, and then we have to live with that decision. 5 justices can create the law of the land, equal to Congress, equal to an executive order of the president. Millions of people vote for those Congress people. Millions of people vote for that president. No one votes for the U.S. Supreme Court justices, and yet they have this co-equal power. There's nothing actually in the Constitution that says the Supreme Court is supposed to oversee the other two branches. It was created through case law, and it's the case of Marbury versus Madison that gives the Supreme Court its power to oversee the other two branches to ensure that they are acting within the Constitution. So that judicial review from Marbury versus Madison lays the foundation for the power of the U.S. Supreme Court. The court gave itself the power to review the other two branches. Can see the power of the Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court justices are interpreting the Constitution, and they're interpreting the congressional statutes. They're interpreting the executive orders of the president. We know that 5-4 decisions come about with people who are all reading the same briefs, they're all hearing the same oral arguments. Then why do we have 5-4 decisions? Because their perspective on the law differs one from another.
It's what did the words mean to the people who ratified the Bill of Rights or who ratified the Constitution?
As opposed to what people today think it means.
As opposed to what people today would like.
I would describe my view of the Constitution as very much in line with Justice Thurgood Marshall's view. And Justice Marshall said, I celebrate not the Constitution that was published in 1787, but what the Constitution has become over 2 centuries of sometimes turbulent existence.
There are different philosophies. So there are originalists. What originalism says is that when the court is examining the Constitution and its application to a particular case, it will examine the words of the Constitution, the text, its structure, and will try to interpret those words and phrases in accordance with how those words and phrases were understood by the public at large at the time those particular provisions in the Constitution were ratified. And if the public doesn't like that interpretation, then Article 5 of the Constitution provides a process by which they can amend the Constitution. There are other so-called living constitutionalists who believe that the words and phrases in the Constitution are more malleable, and that the court should not have to rely on the amendment process to, if you will, update the Constitution, and that under the guise of interpreting the Constitution, to try to update it to current mores. I, for one, am a little bit skeptical of that. I don't think the current mores should be determined for the most part by 9 lawyers in robes who come predominantly from Ivy League schools from the 2 coasts, but that is a different philosophy in which people believe that this is a living document that should periodically be updated, and they look to the Supreme Court to provide those updates.
People who think that the framework of the Constitution should be based on what the framers thought at the time are people who look at a conservative viewpoint, almost a fundamentalist viewpoint of the Constitution. There is no one framer. There is no one original intent. You have, dozens of people in a room creating a document. And so the abolitionists in the room should get as much credit for their ability to say, we're going to end slavery in 1808, as we have the slaveholders in the room who say that slavery is going to be continued through the bounty hunting of the article of the Fugitive Slave Act that's within the Constitution. There's no one mindset. I believe that the reason why our Constitution is the longest standing Constitution in the world is because it's been able to ebb and flow and grow and expand with the issues before the court.
It is the public's belief that judges who are originalists tend to be more conservative, and judges who believe that the Constitution is a living document tend to be more liberal. If you look at the opinions that have been issued by the Supreme Court, it tends to fall along those lines. I do not think that a judge's judicial philosophy necessarily has a political bent or spin to it. I think that the courts primarily look at an issue in terms of what the law does allow or does not allow. Now, does it have some political impact? I think that that probably is true. Does it have a political intent? I think that that is probably not true. I think that there was a big switch in terms of the way that the public perceived the power of the and role of the Supreme Court with the Supreme Court's ruling in the Citizens United case back in 2010. That's an example of a case that I believe contributed to the perception that the court was ruling along ideological lines.
Today, in a 5-4 ruling, a deeply divided Supreme Court said the ban on corporate spending violated First Amendment guarantees of free speech. The ruling demolished the foundation of campaign finance laws, going back to Teddy Roosevelt's days.
Citizens United was one of the more notable of a series of highly ideological, divisive decisions that did cause the court to take a hit in public opinion. Citizens United made a movie attacking a particular candidate, Hillary Clinton.
Hillary is really the closest thing we have in America to a European socialist.
If you thought you knew everything about Hillary Clinton, wait till you see the movie. Hillary, the movie.
It wanted essentially to take advantage of a long-standing rule, which is that campaign finance rules don't apply to media products. And then it wanted its movie declared a media product. And so it asked for that. The Federal Election Commission, which is the regulator in this area, said no. That went up to the Supreme Court. What ended up happening was a much broader showdown over the constitutionality of a significant portion of campaign finance law generally, which had limited the ability of corporations, both nonprofit and for-profit, to engage in electoral advocacy. In effect, what the Supreme Court did is it laid the groundwork for a small number of really, truly wealthy mega millionaire and billionaire donors to really have an outsized impact on our elections. So the question comes up was this a partisan rule? And the answer is more complicated than you might think. It is certainly true that the 5 justices in the majority all were appointed by Republican presidents. The 4 justices in the minority is actually split 3-1. But that is not, and it should not be conflated with just sort of the sheer partisan interests of the two parties. It really more reflects that there are sharper divisions both over election law between the two parties and over, frankly, jurisprudence.
The days of justices getting confirmed 96-3, as say Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was, those days are over.
I believe that Supreme Court confirmation hearings became much more contentious after a spirit of bipartisanship left the United States. As the United States has become more partisan, then the appointments to the Supreme Court have taken on a more partisan tone, and the Senate confirmation hearings have become more fraught with the kind of political overtone that judges particularly are not used to and really don't want to be involved in.
President Obama is telling senators to do their job and keep an open mind on his next Supreme Court nominee. Senate Republicans vow to reject whomever the president recommends.
I intend to make 2016 a referendum on the U.S. Supreme Court.
Since my nomination in July, there's been a frenzy on the left to come up with something, anything, to block my confirmation.
Where things really changed were with the Bork confirmation. Things have really not been the same since then.
The democratically controlled Senate rejected the arch-conservative after one of the most contentious confirmation hearings ever.
In Robert Bork's America, there is no room at the inn for blacks and no place in the Constitution for women. And in our America, there should be no seat on the Supreme Court for Robert Bork.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg said that a prospective justice shouldn't offer any hints or suggestions about he or she might rule in a particular case.
For that would show not only disregard for the specifics of the particular case, it would display disdain for the entire judicial process.
I think that is the right approach, and other than Robert Bork, nominees have adhered to that. Because the Supreme Court now decides a lot of issues, particularly social issues, that the public cares a lot about, you will get people on the right or left trying to get nominees to commit to overturning or reaffirming decisions that they either don't like or that they like.
Tonight, if all goes as Republicans plan, Judge Amy Coney Barrett will become Justice Barrett and could be at work in her court chambers as soon as tomorrow morning.
In 2017, Barrett published a journal article criticizing the rulings that upheld the Affordable Care Act.
A vote for Judge Barrett is very simple. It's a vote to take health care away from 20 million Americans.
This was going to be contentious for a variety of reasons. One, concerns by people on the left as to how she might rule in particular cases that they care about. Two, this was an election year. The general public was going to be voting in the very, very near future. And of course, the people on the left remember that in an election year, the Republicans had not given a hearing to at the time, Chief Judge Merrick Garland of the D.C. Circuit. And I suppose the most contentious thing at all, Amy Coney Barrett was going to be replacing, if confirmed, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And that had a real chance to change the political philosophy, or certainly the judicial philosophy, of a majority of the court. And so there are only 9 Supreme Court justices. They're very, very important. Vacancies don't come along that often. They're all very important and contentious hearings. But when you're, for instance, replacing an Antonin Scalia with a Neil Gorsuch, speaking in broad terms, replacing a conservative with a conservative, the stakes are not quite as high as when you are replacing either a liberal with a conservative or vice versa. So for all those reasons, the stakes were high.
In last night's debate, several Democratic presidential candidates were asked if they would consider expanding the Supreme Court. It's a concept commonly referred to as court packing.
Some Democrats are urging to pack the court, add more members to the Supreme Court if they win a Senate majority.
The judiciary has no fixed size. The Supreme Court has no fixed size. It started out with 6 members, then 5 members a couple hundred years ago. At one point after the Civil War, there were 10 members. I don't think that 9 is a magic number. I am concerned about the idea of the potential tit for tat that would happen if, for example, Democrats added 4 justices in 2021. You could easily see a Republican president with a Republican Senate themselves adding 4 justices in 2025, and then you'd have a court of 87 justices in a few decades, and it would be very confusing and sort of pointless and neutered. I think we need to fix the court, and I think there's several ways that we can fix the court. There are other reforms that can be done to the court that can make it apolitical and not a political football, whereas adding justices would make it even more of a political football. When I think about the structure of the Supreme Court, I am concerned about how long justices are serving and how contentious their confirmation hearings are. My view is that the Supreme Court would be better off, and America would be better off, if instead of having justices serving for 30, 35 years without any accountability, to have 18-year term limits for all future justices. If there are 9 justices, each serving 18 years, that means every 2 years, every non-election year that is, we would have a new justice being added to the court.
I don't believe that the court is broken on some fundamental level. I think what's happening is that people who are worried that the Supreme Court will reach decisions that they really don't like are trying to constrain and limit the court to avoid those outcomes. I think those same people mostly are very happy with the court when it does what they want. So I think calls to fix the court tend to go along with the politics of the moment and the perception of where the Supreme Court is likely to go in the future. In my view, you do need a constitutional amendment if you're going to add term limits to the current justices. The Constitution says that the justices serve during good behavior. That doesn't mean term limits. It's a slim possibility, but I don't think either side right now would have a deep objection to term limits, especially if they were set up so that the current justices were grandfathered in.
Constitutional amendments sound great, but they're not realistic in this day and age. The idea that 38 states and 2/3 of Congress would agree on anything, it just seems farcical. You could have term limits for the Supreme Court prospectively via statute. You do not need a constitutional amendment. Why is that? There's something called senior status. Once you serve for a certain amount of time on a lower court and you've reached age 65, basically what you do is you step back. You only hear about a quarter of the cases. That's a wholly created invention of Congress. So I believe you could do the same at the Supreme Court.
There are so many cases that we think of that are really prominent that Congress could override, not through a constitutional amendment, but just by passing legislation that would overturn these decisions that, hurt the little guy, for example. I think that Congress has an obligation to take back power. So the court decides two main types of decisions. There are constitutional decisions where the Supreme Court will look at the merits of a case, at the question that the case involves, and say, does this violate the Constitution? Does this violate our constitutional amendments? And then there are what's known as statutory cases, where the court interprets a law that Congress made, and they decide if what is happening in the case, what the questions of the case are, if that was Congress's original intent. When it comes to these statutory decisions, Congress has a lot of power there. Congress can say, actually, Supreme Court, that's not really what we meant when we wrote that law. And we're going to clarify the law, and we're going to pass a statutory override where they basically overturn a Supreme Court decision. One of the most prominent examples of a statutory override, at least in recent memory, is the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. And this was the first piece of legislation that President Obama signed in 2009. This legislation updated the statute of limitations and said that actually, Lilly Ledbetter, you can bring your case because you've experienced pay discrimination for your entire career. It did help that Lilly Ledbetter was a great advocate for the case. She really made people feel outraged. They thought this was a really bad Supreme Court decision, and so that momentum helped push the legislation over the finish line.
There's no question that the Supreme Court is more powerful now than it was 200 years ago. It's not necessarily more powerful now, though, than it was 75 years ago when it decided Brown against the Board of Education. Ending segregation in the United States was an enormous decision of great historical consequence, hugely controversial at the time, especially among white Southerners, but the Supreme Court did it, and it did it on its own by fiat. When the Supreme Court decides something that makes you happy, whatever your views happen to be, you always think that the Supreme Court is not too powerful, it's just vindicating fundamental rights. And that's true whether you're talking about the Supreme Court's influential and important decision institutionalizing gay marriage, or if you're thinking about a decision like the one where the Supreme Court significantly curtailed the Voting Rights Act. In some hot-button issues that have major ideological content, you can make a reasonable guess as to what the justices will do. But sometimes you get it completely wrong, and we saw that quite recently when Justice Neil Gorsuch, named by Donald Trump, delivered the opinion and one of the deciding votes in a decision to extend basic civil rights against employment discrimination to gay and trans people, which is not something that anybody expected a Trump administration appointee to do.
There's an interesting phenomenon where we see that on quote-unquote social issues, so-called conservative justices follow and in some sense mirror public opinion. I do not think that that trend extends to issues involving election law and issues involving corporate rights, which both of which obviously are central to Citizens United. There, you see much more ideological fealty on the part of the conservative justices, even when that lands them in positions that are diametrically opposed to public opinion. The Supreme Court is not a nakedly partisan institution. Is the Supreme Court a highly ideological institution? And does its ideology tend mostly to be consistent with the ideology that is in fashion in one of our two major parties? Yes. The reality is, in many of these cases, the American people, regardless of party identification, disagree with the court's approach.
There's a crisis of confidence in the federal government. And if the American people don't trust their courts, don't trust the judgment of their courts, that's a real problem for our democracy. I want to see the Supreme Court come out of the shadows. I want to see the justices take more responsibility, to come together, to have more narrow opinions, not these broad strokes that are very partisan. And I think that if the court does that, and if we learn more about who these justices are and how they operate, that would be beneficial to the country.
The Supreme Court is made up of human beings, and so whatever human beings do will be imperfect. This is an imperfect nation, an imperfect system. We know very little about the private lives of our Supreme Court justices. They're shielded because we want them to be neutral, but they're human beings, and when people protest and come to the court and make their demands, then they can be touched as well as human beings.
Most reasonable visions of how Supreme Court justices should decide cases include an eye on real-world consequences. So it's not a violation of the justice's obligation if they ask themselves, what will actually happen in the world as a result of our decisions? In fact, in my view, a justice should be asking that question.
They need some background in making rulings and judgment that changes people's lives. I would like to challenge every one of them to be sure that every decision they make, that they can live with and know that it's the right thing to do.